Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, episode 37, Man in the Middle. Last time we finished our discussion of New York's colonial period. Today we're going to restart the history of colonial Pennsylvania. This episode draws especially from the book Quakers and Politics, Pennsylvania 1681 to 1726 by Gary B. Nash. Since it's been a little while since we talked about Pennsylvania, let me recap the story so far. Pennsylvania was the brainchild of William Penn. Penn had been born into a very prominent family with connections to the Stuarts, but as a young man he converted to Quakerism, a radical Christian sect whose members were persecuted by the government. Because of his background, Penn was one of the richest and most influential Quakers. He decided to use his position to create a new colony in America, which would serve as a refuge for his Quaker brethren. He first became involved in the plan to colonize New Jersey in the 1670s. A few Quakers started trickling in, but Penn decided that New Jersey wasn't big enough, and so he got the rights to a much larger grant of land, which stretched all the way from the Delaware to the Great Lakes. William Penn was the sole proprietor of this new colony. It was his to do with as he pleased, but he chose to give the colony a fairly liberal constitution, with himself still in charge, of course. Notably, the upper house of the legislature was to be elected rather than appointed. However, the lower house was not all that powerful. When Penn was in the colony, he would serve as governor himself. When he was absent, he could appoint a deputy governor to rule instead, who was usually just called the governor. The first colonists set off for Pennsylvania in 1682, Penn himself included. The colony attracted lots of immigrants, but Penn always had problems. For one thing, many of the colonists resented the power he held as proprietor. Almost immediately, they forced him to substantially revise Pennsylvania's constitution. He also had lots of money problems. And he had endless legal headaches thanks to what is now the state of Delaware. You see, Pennsylvania itself didn't quite reach the ocean, and in order to ensure that this colony had access to the sea, Penn had also purchased a smaller strip of land adjacent to Pennsylvania along the Delaware Bay. But for one thing, the area was already inhabited by non-Quakers who resented being lumped in with Pennsylvania. For another thing, the land was also claimed by Maryland. In fact, after only a few years in America, Penn had to return to England to defend his claim to Delaware, and it would be over a decade and a half before he managed to return. The voting system was pretty similar to what we've heard about elsewhere. The property requirements were normal and most adult men had the vote. Elections were held annually on October 1st for most of the colonial period. Voting was done either inside or outside the county courthouse, depending on the weather. Turnout was typically between 20 and 40%. Let me read you a description of a standard Pennsylvania election by historian Chester Raymond Young. Quote, "The voter handed the election clerk a paper or ticket on which he had written the names of the 8 candidates for whom he was voting. If an illiterate person appeared with his paper, the names on it were read aloud by the sheriff to make certain he wanted to vote for those individuals. In case an elector brought no ballot with him, he was allowed to give his vote orally. If challenged by an election inspector, a voter was required to affirm that he possessed the qualifications required by the 1706 law and that he had not already voted that day. The polls were open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and the election continued for as many days as were necessary to allow each freeholder to vote. When the voting was completed, the sheriff opened the ballot box in the presence of the inspectors. The ballots were taken out and read aloud one by one and a tally made. Then the names of the 8 men who received the highest vote would be announced as the assemblyman for that county. If a ballot listed more than 8 names or had a second paper folded in with it, it was rejected." End quote. So that's roughly where we left Pennsylvania. The colony was young and growing fast, but already there were problems on the horizon. Penn's absence meant that he had to govern his colony from a distance, through proxies, and it didn't help that a number of Penn's most prominent supporters within Pennsylvania soon either left the colony or died. That created a power vacuum, and other Quaker elites with fewer personal ties to the Penn family moved in to fill it. I've talked before about how sometimes factions in the colonies were divided along the lines of court versus country, that is, those who defended the privileges of the king versus those who fought for local autonomy. Well, that was what was happening in Pennsylvania, only with the proprietor in place of the king. It's rather like the opposition to the Calvert family in Maryland. The colonists had no interest in letting William Penn control things. They wanted as much self-government as possible. Certainly the non-Quakers in Delaware wanted as little to do with Penn as possible, but even the Quakers were too independent-minded to accept his authority unquestioningly. And from the start, Penn pursued policies which were bound to make him unpopular. I won't get into all the details here, but basically to the colonists it seemed like Penn was arbitrarily favoring himself and his friends at the expense of everyone else. Which he kind of was. In particular, his land policy was very unfair. He gave himself large tracts of land which were exempt from taxation, land which often went unfarmed instead of being put to use. He came up with unpopular rules about the buying and selling of land, and then he exempted his friends from those unpopular rules. So bad laws plus favoritism plus high rents plus an absent proprietor. It was not a recipe for popularity. An anti-proprietary faction opposed to Penn began forming within just a few years. When Penn had left, rather than appoint a governor, he decided to place all executive authority within the council as a whole. In the beginning, the upper house was controlled by Penn's allies, so this must have seemed like a safe bet to Penn at the time. However, as the decade went on, the council became increasingly estranged from the proprietor, partly just because of those unpopular policies that Penn supported. But also the council was becoming more and more powerful the longer Penn was in England. They were now appointing officials and proposing new laws entirely on their own authority, and that was power they didn't want to give up. So when word reached Penn that the council was becoming disobedient, he decided to take some of their powers away. The council would no longer have executive authority. Instead, Penn created a smaller group of just 5 appointed men to run things. The Commission of State it was called. You can think of it as kind of an attempt to create a normal appointed upper house like other colonies had. Penn hoped that they would defend his interests better, but the Commission of State proved to be just as useless to Penn as the council. The men he appointed were variously either unpopular with the colonists or at odds with one another, or they turned out to be just opposed to proprietary authority. Penn was rapidly becoming so powerless that there was hardly a proprietary faction at all to support him. Normally, even if the ruler of a colony was unpopular, he could at least assemble a coalition to support him, thanks merely to the fact that he had the power to give people lucrative jobs. That alone meant that some number of colonists would support him simply out of hope for further advancement. However, Penn had mostly surrendered his control over appointments, so he didn't even have patronage anymore. The anti-proprietary faction now pretty much controlled the government top to bottom. In fact, the anti-proprietary faction was so successful so fast that an opposition began forming against them. This divide was basically economic. There wasn't much of an upper class in Pennsylvania, but one was starting to form under the more prosperous merchants in the colony. These guys weren't that much richer than anyone else, but they were trying to turn themselves into a little ruling class. These people were the ones currently running the government, who had been fighting against Penn. I'll call them the elite Quakers. In opposition to the elite Quakers were the middling Quakers, the middle class who were worried about being shut out of power by this new elite, shopkeepers and small landowners and the like. These guys were also opposed to proprietary authority, but they were willing to cooperate with it sometimes when it benefited them. The elite Quakers dominated the council, while the middling Quakers had their base of support in the assembly. And on top of these factions, there were also the non-Quakers who dominated in Delaware, but were otherwise mostly shut out from power. But basically it became a 3-way struggle between Penn, the elite Quakers, and the middling Quakers. In particular, the elite and middling Quakers fought over how much power the assembly should have. The council had been steadily increasing its authority at the expense of William Penn, but now the assembly was trying to take some of that power for itself. They wanted the right to propose new legislation, to propose amendments to bills, that sort of thing. The same desires every colonial lower house had. Penn tried to play them off against each other, but whichever side he supported, he wound up giving more power to men who were fundamentally opposed to him. It was a no-win situation. Increasingly despondent, Penn wrote to the colonists, begging them, quote, "For the love of God, me and the poor country, be not so governmentish, so noisy and open in your dissatisfactions." End quote. Penn decided that in order to enforce his will properly, he was going to have to name a governor to run things instead of a committee. His first choice was a Welsh Quaker named Thomas Lloyd, who had previously been in both the Council and the Commission of State. Lloyd was actually an opponent of Penn, but Penn hoped that he could use the appointment as a peace offering. However, Lloyd declined, since he didn't want to have to enforce Penn's unpopular policies. So instead, Penn chose a Puritan soldier named John Blackwell. That didn't go well either. As a Puritan, Blackwell was temperamentally opposed to the Quakers, and Thomas Lloyd, acting as leader of the opposition, did everything he could to stonewall him. Both sides resented each other and nothing much got done. Blackwell resigned after a year and the council took over again, under the leadership of Thomas Lloyd. The anti-proprietary faction, specifically the elite Quakers, were back in charge and fully in control of every level of government. But you won't be surprised to hear that almost immediately new problems popped up. For one thing, the Glorious Revolution happened in 1688, which I'll get to in a minute. But also there was a surprise religious controversy to liven things up. Enter George Keith. Keith was an intellectual Quaker who had first immigrated to East Jersey before moving to Pennsylvania to become a schoolmaster. Keith was very argumentative, always looking to pick fights over doctrine. He thought that Quakerism had become too lax and he meant to remedy that. However, the other Quakers in Pennsylvania rebuffed his proposals for reform. They weren't interested in intellectual doctrinal faith. That would defeat the whole purpose of Quakerism. The inner light was enough for them. But Keith refused to take no for an answer. He kept escalating the dispute until he got expelled from his local Quaker meeting in 1692. Even that wasn't enough to end things. In fact, Keith escalated his attacks to include Thomas Lloyd and the rest of the government, so what had been just a religious dispute now became a political one. It's kind of like what happened in Massachusetts. Back in the 1630s, when Massachusetts was just getting started, reformers like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson had challenged the religious establishment. And because church and state were so closely linked to one another, a religious challenge almost certainly meant a political dispute as well. How far would the government go to enforce orthodoxy? Would they be willing to clamp down, or would the colony fall into disunity almost immediately? In Massachusetts, officials had cracked down. Williams and Hutchinson had gone into exile in Rhode Island. And for the next half-century, things remained calm. In Pennsylvania, things didn't go that far, but the government did still try to stop Keith. In order to prevent him from distributing pamphlets, they had his printer imprisoned for 4 months without charges. Then the council banned the printing of all seditious material. Then they imprisoned Keith and several of his followers, though without seriously punishing them. That polarized Pennsylvania even more. Although truth be told, there weren't that many followers of Keith, at least not that many who agreed with his ideas about Quakerism. Mostly Keith was an excuse for people with pre-existing grudges to attack the government. His biggest supporters were men who were already opponents of Lloyd, and his biggest opponents were already supporters of Lloyd. In fact, the overlap was pretty overwhelming. So really this was a continuation of the elite versus middling fight rather than something new. The divide was given a new intensity thanks to the religious angle, but that's all. It was a roundabout way for middling Quakers to attack the government. Once again, religion, class, and politics all fed into and amplified each other. However, Keith left the colony of his own accord in late 1693, and without his presence, the religious dispute itself died down. But that just meant Pennsylvanians could move on to bigger problems. The Glorious Revolution had happened 5 years ago in 1688. Within Pennsylvania, it didn't lead to anything as dramatic as the fall of the Dominion, but it was still important. For one thing, it meant that Penn was still stuck in England. He had been a close friend of James II, but after James was overthrown, he fell under suspicion from the new regime. He was even arrested for treason twice. Plus, there were serious worries that the crown would take Pennsylvania away from him altogether, so there was no way he could return to America anytime soon. Also, the Glorious Revolution led directly into King William's War, which meant that the colonies would be fighting Quebec. In New England or New York, war simply meant war. Death, destruction, defeat, debt. But in Pennsylvania, the problems caused by the war were quite different. Pennsylvania was far from the front lines, and it was controlled by pacifist Quakers. You might think that the colony would thus be able to make it through the war unscathed, but it was not to be. Firstly, the war further inflamed tensions between Delaware and the rest of Pennsylvania. Delaware, being on the coast, was more exposed to naval attack. The colonists in Delaware pushed the government to beef up their defenses, which were currently non-existent, but the Quakers blocked any such attempts. The residents of Delaware decided to force the issue by more or less seceding from Pennsylvania altogether. The representatives from Delaware began meeting on their own as a separate legislature. They started appointing their own officials without regard to the rest of Pennsylvania. Given that the Quakers weren't about to use force to bring Delaware back under control, there wasn't much they could do about it. So they just had to live with it. Penn appointed a separate governor for Delaware, and from now on the two colonies would be at least semi-independent from one another, although they weren't formally split up until 1701. But it wasn't just Delawareans who wanted Pennsylvania to be more aggressive. So too did the Board of Trade and everyone else in the empire. England couldn't hope to fight the French if there was a Pennsylvania-sized gap in their defenses. Even if Pennsylvania refused to raise a militia, the least they could do was send money to the other colonies to help. However, even that seemed to conflict with Quaker principles, since you'd still be raising money to help fight a war. And in any case, who wants to pay extra taxes to help someone else fight? But to England, this was a serious problem. Serious enough, in fact, that King William decided to take Pennsylvania away from William Penn altogether and turn it into a royal colony. Penn's constitution would be thrown out and replaced by a standard royal constitution, with a powerful governor and an appointed council. That was a big change, very similar to the creation of the Dominion of New England, except limited to just one colony. After barely 10 years in charge, Penn had already lost his colony. But that's what happens when you're on the wrong side of a revolution. The new governor that King William chose was actually Benjamin Fletcher, who is also currently serving as the governor of New York. He was that very corrupt governor I talked about in episode 34, the one who gave away lots of land to his supporters. It was hoped that sharing a governor would help the colonies coordinate better. But naturally, he was an unpopular choice. All of these changes meant that the elite Quaker faction, the one led by Thomas Lloyd, was being forced out of power. They immediately began opposing Governor Fletcher. They didn't like being under Penn's authority, but this was worse. and Fletcher naturally turned to the middling Quakers instead, those who had supported George Keith. These were the men he appointed to the council and to other important posts. Those guys weren't exactly in favor of royal control either, but I guess they were happy enough to take power for themselves. Again, this is a pretty standard pattern. A new governor arrives in a divided colony and decides to support whichever faction seems like the lesser of two evils. The elite Quakers, having been kicked out of the council, moved their base of operations down into the assembly. There they led a very successful effort to stonewall Governor Fletcher as much as possible, just like with Governor Blackwell a few years ago. Most importantly, they managed to block most of his attempts to raise money for the war effort. That was a big problem. The whole point of turning Pennsylvania into a royal colony was to raise that money, but Governor Fletcher was proving no more successful than before. And in fact, his failure brought this experiment in royal government to a swift end. Penn was starting to regain some of his influence at court, and after only 2 years, King William agreed to hand Pennsylvania back to Penn, on the condition that he do more to help with the war. I'm sure the lesson was not lost on Penn that if he failed again, he could lose his colony for good. But once again, obstruction proved to be a useful way to get rid of an unwanted governor. So the government was back in Penn's hands, and he had to raise that money no matter what. But the legislature was unwilling to do so without concessions. In fact, they wanted major changes to Penn's constitution for the colony. In particular, they wanted to strengthen the power of the assembly. That was a major reversal for the elite Quakers, who had previously been the ones trying to weaken the assembly. Why the change? Well, since they had been kicked out of the council once, it stood to reason that they might get kicked out again, in which case it made more sense to focus their efforts on the assembly, where the only ones who could kick them out were the voters, who they thought they could control better. They had other demands as well, which included cutting the size of both the council and assembly by half, plus changes to the franchise aimed at weakening the power of non-Quakers. In particular, the property requirement for rural voters was cut by half, while the requirement for urban voters was increased. Also, residents would have to live in the colony for a year before they could vote. Since non-Quakers tended to be newcomers who lived in Philadelphia, these proposed changes would make it harder for them to vote while impacting the Quakers much less. Add it all up and we're looking at a minor constitutional revolution. The elite Quakers were strengthening themselves at the expense of both William Penn and their opponents within the colony. Penn had no interest in any of these changes, but the elite Quakers linked the reforms to the money Penn was demanding. No reforms, no money. And since Penn still risked losing his charter if he failed, he ultimately had little choice but to capitulate, and after a year's delay in 1696 the changes were passed into law. A steep price to pay for a fairly small sum of money. The assembly really was swiftly becoming the central governing body within Pennsylvania. I should mention that Thomas Lloyd had died in 1694. He was succeeded by his distant cousin David Lloyd, who will stick around as one of the most important Pennsylvanians over the next few decades. David Lloyd came from a lower-class background, but he'd worked his way up in society. First, while in England, he'd helped William Penn manage some legal affairs concerning land in Pennsylvania. Then he had moved to Pennsylvania himself. Thanks to his relationship with Penn and with his cousin Thomas, he quickly worked his way up through government. However, he eventually began opposing Penn, and when Thomas died, he took over as leader of the anti-proprietary faction. Anyway, King William's War came to an end in 1697. The next big issue was smuggling. Like every other colony, Pennsylvania was doing its level best to avoid enforcing the Navigation Acts. Parliament passed further laws to strengthen the acts, but Pennsylvania passed its own laws to undermine them. The Board of Trade told Penn to crack down on his unruly colonists and to remove intransigent officials from office. Penn decided that this was an opportune time to finally get back to his colony and see for himself how things were going. Another reason for the visit was that Penn was now deeply in debt, and he hoped that by returning to Pennsylvania he could raise more money. And so, in December 1699, he found himself back in Philadelphia, which had already grown to 5,000 people, as big as New York City, second only to Boston. And all that growth after less than 20 years. 80 years on after Jamestown, the English had finally figured out how to do colonization right. The elite Quaker faction, led by David Lloyd, remained in power at all levels of government, and they had the support of most Quakers. The opposition, which included middling Quakers and the growing Anglican population, was stuck on the sidelines. There was a brief honeymoon period after Penn's arrival, and the legislature agreed to crack down on smuggling. But within a few months, things went back to normal and he wasn't able to get much more done. And once again, his policies undermined his popularity. He tried to resurvey land and began collecting the rents that he was owed. He tried to dislodge David Lloyd and the anti-proprietary faction from power, but failed. In any case, within 2 years, Penn had to return to England yet again. Parliament was again considering a bill which would place Pennsylvania back under royal control, and Penn decided that his presence would be required in order to stop it. The fact that Penn would be leaving, possibly for good, and the fact that Pennsylvania might soon become a royal province for good, encouraged the leadership within Pennsylvania to push for even more constitutional reforms while Penn was still in the colony. Basically, the Assembly wanted to force Penn into giving them even more power in the case Pennsylvania was annexed by the Crown, because after that the opportunities for them to make further constitutional changes would be slim at best. They needed to maximize their amount of self-government ASAP. However, it was no longer the elite Quakers who were leading the push for self-government. David Lloyd had shifted his allegiance to become leader of the middling Quakers, which was an easier thing to do in the days before political parties, and now they were the ones pushing for greater independence. Why the switch? Why didn't Lloyd just stick with the elite Quakers? One possible reason is that Lloyd was determined to keep increasing Pennsylvania's independence, while the elite Quakers had become less interested. On the other hand, the middling Quakers were becoming more interested. In other words, David Lloyd's views now aligned better with the middling Quakers, and so he switched. People at the time had a less flattering view of Lloyd. Many back then thought that he was driven by personal issues, general resentment against authority, hostility towards William Penn, rather than by any high-minded principles. Of course, it's impossible to know the truth about someone's motives, especially from a distance of 3 centuries. And in any case, those two possibilities aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes we start off by holding a petty grudge against someone, and then we come up with some justification for that grudge, and over time that justification comes to drive us just as much as the original grudge ever did. And sometimes people just want power. As far as history is concerned, it might not even matter what someone's motivations are, just their actions. Either way, the outcome was the same. Lloyd changed sides. But that raises another question. Why were the elite and middling Quakers changing their positions? Well, I think, and this is just my speculation, that as time went on, self-government was coming to mean something quite different. Early on, self-government had meant, in practice, rule by the elite Quakers. There wasn't yet that much political awareness among the people, and so the elite Quakers naturally took power. However, after 2 decades, your average Pennsylvanian was starting to understand that he had real power over the government, that a powerful assembly would make him powerful. So self-government now meant power for the people instead of power for the elite. Hence it was now the middling Quakers who most wanted to strengthen the assembly. Now, don't get me wrong, everyone was still in favor of self-government overall, but their relative positions had changed. And so Lloyd switched sides. In fact, he made an active effort to reach out to the average Pennsylvania citizen. Under his watch, laws were passed which required elections to be publicly advertised in advance so that everyone would know when they were happening. He was even willing to ally with Anglicans and old supporters of George Keith when the opportunity arose. Naturally, these actions considerably increased the number of politically active men, by bringing in groups that normally would have been much more passive. Anyway, Lloyd and his supporters presented William Penn with a set of proposals for further reforms. Some of them, such as the changes to Penn's land policies, were popular among elite and middling Quakers alike, but others, such as the proposed constitutional reforms, were much more controversial. Penn resisted most of these demands since they meant that his own authority would be weakened even further. However, he found that he had little choice in the matter, given that most of the rest of the colony was against him. Even his supporters only supported him part way, while his opponents opposed him wholeheartedly. Only days before he sailed back to England, he reluctantly agreed to the changes. Part of the reason he caved in was that he expected to lose Pennsylvania anyway, so whatever changes he accepted probably wouldn't matter too much. But he didn't lose control of Pennsylvania, so in fact these changes mattered a whole lot. Really, it was a whole new constitution. Most notably, the council completely lost its role as a legislative body. It no longer had the right to propose laws. It could no longer veto laws proposed by the Assembly. Nothing. It was now merely an advisory body for the proprietor, a bit like a modern cabinet. The Assembly became the sole legislative body within the colony, making Pennsylvania and Delaware the only unicameral colonies in America. This may be the closest America ever came to parliamentary government. The Assembly hadn't become the sole governing body, but it was certainly moving in that direction. Perhaps if more colonial legislatures had gained this level of power before the American Revolution, the Constitution would have turned out quite different, with less of an emphasis on presidential power. Maybe, who knows? In addition to that change, other features of Penn's Constitution, such as term limits, were dropped as well, and Delaware was finally separated from the rest of Pennsylvania. This new Constitution would last until the Revolution. With that out of the way, Penn sailed back to England, defeated yet again. He was hopelessly stuck in the middle between English officials and his own colonists. There was just no way to please one without enraging the other, and so he had to make concession after concession. Like with so many other idealistic plans for colonization, his plan had fallen flat. For comparison, think of John Locke's fundamental constitutions of Carolina. It was just next to impossible to force the colonists to act against their wills. They had most of the power, and they used it. No one in England had the will to really coerce the colonies into doing their bidding, and certainly a pacifist like William Penn would never crack down on his own people. Therefore, there was nothing much to be done. His authority as proprietor was predestined to be sloughed off by the Pennsylvanians. Penn's bad luck, ineptness, and inflexibility undoubtedly hurried matters along, but it would have happened regardless. His colony was no longer really his. It was already out of his hands. And though he couldn't have known it as he sailed off into the Atlantic, he'd never see Pennsylvania again. Next episode, we'll discuss the next few decades of Pennsylvania's history as the rivalries within the colony heat up even more. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. The podcast is on Twitter @EarlyOftenPod, or go to the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com for transcripts of every single episode. And if you like the podcast, give it a good review on iTunes. That helps. Thanks for listening.